And I'd just like to introduce Andrew Feinstein onto this discussion about the New Year's honours list, which I never thought we'd be talking about the New Year's honours list on this show, but what's happened is Rachel Riley has been awarded an MBE, and lots of people have not wanted to talk about this issue because obviously there's people have got made up their minds that it's not something that they'd like to address, because sometimes the lawyers get involved in things and they're maybe a bit intimidated. But Andrew, the situation with perceived legal threats, or people worried that they may face a legal threat even though maybe that nothing's been received, how do you see this as damaging to our democracy, people not being able to speak without fear?
Well, I think these so-called slap orders, where basically individuals are targeted by lawyers who seem to spend their professional lives using these sorts of orders to try and silence people whose views they don't like. And it's deeply, deeply problematic. And it comes within the broader context that you've discussed on your show a number of times of the closing down of the democratic space in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, but also of the right to protest. And I would say that this is all a part of that sort of continuum. And one good example of it, there are many. I mean, we get, footballers who are alleged to have mistreated their partners or to be having affairs or whatever the case is, or celebrities of various sorts, and they get these very powerful city lawyers to effectively silence those who are raising these allegations, or in some instances, these realities about these people. But where it becomes even more pernicious is when it's used to close down debate on very important topics of national and global interest. And, the United Kingdom has appalling libel and defamation laws. That's the first thing to say. And I think that what those libel and defamation laws do is they protect the establishment, and particularly the wealthy establishment, and the establishment tends to be very wealthy, because it is a way of muting criticism of what is a captured democracy. Now, where that manifests at a sort of a more international level is when we see countries, and they tend to be countries that are engaged in massive corruption, massive human rights abuses, massive violation of their own domestic laws and international law. So countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, they also use these sorts of mechanisms, and they use lawyers in countries like the United Kingdom to try and close down debate of the reality of their governance. And this is a case in point. Now, let me address the issue of the honours list from what might be a slightly different perspective, because it's worth bearing in mind that I'm not actually British. I'm from South Africa. I, at this point in my life, only have a South African passport, even though I've lived in the UK for 21 years. So I come from what was part of the British Empire. And the first thing to say is that I have very little, if any, respect for the honours system in this country. For something to be called the Order of the British Empire, or Master of the British Empire, or whatever all of these things say, this is sort of glorifying a process of empire that was absolutely devastating to the countries being colonized by empire. And of course, my own country, South Africa, was one of those. And, for anybody who doesn't know that much about the human impacts of the British Empire, I would strongly recommend the works of an Indian member of parliament, Shashi Thakur, who has written brilliantly on British Empire. And, tens of thousands of people were killed because they were colonial subjects in the British Empire, wanting to keep control of its colonies. So, people who wanted to rise up against empire, against colonization, were dealt with absolutely brutally. And the United Kingdom committed massive human rights abuses in its colonies. Now, I find, since I've lived in this country, I've been astonished by how little is actually understood in Britain about the impacts of empire. So I have to say that I hold far greater respect for those people. Peter Tatchell would be an example, Benjamin Zephaniah, who have rejected honors because of their link to British Empire and the human rights abuses that are associated with empire and the pillage that is associated with British Empire, of Britain actually taking huge amounts of wealth from its colonies and bringing it to the imperial center, which is, of course, London. And there are reminders of this all over the city and all over the country. So I start from a position where, Jimmy Savile was knighted in the honors system. Tony Blair, who is completely unrepentant for the fact that the invasion of Iraq, there's been a new study that I read just a couple of weeks ago that shows that the number of people who have died directly and indirectly as a consequence of the invasion of Iraq by George W. Bush and Tony Blair is well over 1 million now. And the devastation in the country, the ongoing endemic conflict in Iraq continues to this day. And someone like Blair is completely unapologetic and unrepentant about that, or the human cost of it. And of course, he was knighted recently. And I stood outside Windsor Castle at an event organized by Stop the War, actually talking about some of what Tony Blair has been involved in his political life and in making himself a multi-millionaire post leaving office out of the connections and corruption that he facilitated and enabled while he was in office. So it is hardly a surprise that the honors system works to consolidate the grip of the British establishment on British political life. So in the latest New Year's honors list, we see not only Rachel Riley, and I have to confess, before she started tweeting about me, I had absolutely no idea who Rachel Riley is or was. And I still am very unclear why she has any sort of public standing. But that might just be a cultural factor that I didn't grow up in this country, I don't know. But she wasn't the only one. I mean, Marie van der Zyl, the president of the Jewish Board of Deputies, was also given an honor in the honors list. Now, why are these people getting these honors? Well, it's quite clear. They are supposedly being given these honors because of their role in fighting anti-Semitism. But as I've spoken on your program many times before, the so-called fight against anti-Semitism has a very political flavor, and it has a political flavor for a number of reasons. The first and most obvious thing to say is that the fight against anti-Semitism is an absolutely crucial one, wherever and whenever it rears its appalling head. The second thing to say to that is that one has to fight anti-Semitism as part of fighting all racism and discrimination. One cannot pick and choose which racisms one is prepared to struggle against and ignore all others, because you are either an anti-racist or you are part of the racism problem. And so anti-Semitism, it's very important to say, is fought most strongly and most powerfully when it is fought arm in arm with fights against Islamophobia, which has also been increasing massively in the United Kingdom over the past few years. Anti-Black racism, which we have seen a massive rise in, not just in the United States and in the United Kingdom, but in many parts of the world. And all forms of discrimination, be they based on race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. It is then that we are most powerful. And, I do have some history in fighting racism. I was involved in the struggle against apartheid from the 1980s when the ANC was a banned and illegal organization in my own country. And I had the extraordinary honor of serving under Nelson Mandela in South Africa's first democratic parliament. I also, as I've mentioned often before, and many people who don't like the way I talk about anti-Semitism and anti-racism mock me for this, including many Jewish people, for mentioning the fact that I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. I get abused on social media about this all the time and told that my mother, who survived the war hidden in a coal cellar in Vienna itself, must have been a capo, a Nazi sympathizer, which is the most offensive thing you can say to a Jewish person, particularly one whose family lost dozens of members in the Holocaust. And I'm very proud of the fact that I introduced the first ever motion in the history of the South African Parliament on the Holocaust and Holocaust remembrance. I'm very proud of the fact that in my global work on the arms trade, where, by the way, people have tried to sue me for all 20 years that I've been involved in it, and I just send their lawyers information about their very corrupt and appalling behavior, and funnily enough, the cases all seem to go away. But the fact that I've also done an enormous amount of work on genocide prevention and how we can use information from the arms trade to prevent future genocides like we saw in Rwanda, amongst other places, and in Bangladesh, where my partner is from. I also lectured at Auschwitz, where dozens of my mother's family were murdered. So, you know, these are issues that are incredibly important to me. And this is where the issue arises and the problems arise. Because unfortunately, the state of Israel has quite consciously, and there is massive amounts of documentary evidence, both filmed evidence and actual paper documents to illustrate this. They created a department to do this. Israel became very concerned about the sorts of criticisms that were mounting against its human rights abuses, its practice of apartheid against Palestinian citizens of Israel, and its brutal and illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. And it was a very clear and coherent strategy of the department that was created by the Israeli government to try and thwart these rising human rights protests against the state of Israel, to try and identify any criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. And quite clearly, criticism of the state of Israel is not equivalent to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is abuse and discrimination against Jewish people as individuals and as part of a group for their identification as Jewish. It has nothing to do with the state of Israel, unless one uses what is an anti-Semitic trope and attempts to identify all Jews with the actions of the Israeli state, which is quite clearly absurd, because there are many Jews who are citizens of Israel, who are critical of the state of Israel and opposed to its human rights abuses and its racist policies and its policy of occupation. And I am honored to count many of them as colleagues and friends. So it's clearly an absurdity. So why would Rachel Riley and Marie van der Zyl be given honors by the British state? Well, I'm afraid to say that the way in which they try and combat anti-Semitism is with an incredibly facile or superficial understanding of politics. And in fact, the way in which they go about fighting against anti-Semitism feeds in to this narrative of any criticism of Israel and its policies is anti-Semitic. Support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which were such crucial, peaceful strategies to overcome apartheid in South Africa, are in some way anti-Semitic when employed against Israel. And I don't know, to be totally honest with you, I don't know Rachel Riley. I've met Marie van der Zyl once when I attended a meeting at the Jewish Board of Deputies that she chaired. And my only real observation of that was her understanding of politics is incredibly limited. But that was from one meeting, and it's probably unfair a statement to make.
Can I just come in, because I've got a picture I want to show you, that so people can understand Rachel Riley, why we're talking about her at all. On on the left is a picture of Jeremy Corbyn at an anti-apartheid demonstration in the 1980s, being taken away by police with a placard, defend the right to demonstrate against apartheid, join this picket. On the right of the picture is Rachel Riley with that placard with the words Jeremy Corbyn is a racist endeavour transposed on top of it. That was before the 2019 general election, in which over 10 million people voted for Jeremy Corbyn. I have to say, I'm furious that she's been awarded something, having worn that T-shirt, because I voted Labour, and it seems to be implying or that people who support Jeremy Corbyn may well be racist.
This is the nub of the problem. This is what I call about a superficial, facile understanding of politics. I wonder if Rachel Riley is actually aware how deeply offensive the defacing of that poster and that picture, where Jeremy Corbyn was a great colleague and comrade in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, which killed millions of my fellow citizens, which made 83% of the population inferior citizens by law, which, by the way, is something that takes place in Israel with relation to Palestinian citizens as well. So the extraordinary irony of Rachel Riley trying to deface that picture of Jeremy Corbyn is not only offensive to Labour voters who voted for Jeremy Corbyn, many of whom are committed anti-racists, but imagine how offensive it is to South Africans of color and South Africans who struggled against apartheid for decades and decades. I mean, one of our colleagues was thrown out of a 10th floor window in Foster Square in Johannesburg police headquarters because he was a trade unionist committed to bringing about the end of apartheid in South Africa. People were murdered in cold blood. Steve Biko was beaten to death in the back of a police vehicle. But Rachel Riley thinks it's fine to actually abuse that sort of commemoration and commitment and solidarity with the struggle of South Africans against apartheid. And this is the nub of the matter, of awarding these sorts of people honors. Let's be clear about it. What they're being awarded their honors for is their part in making British politics safe for the establishment, so that people don't have to consider the prospect of a social democrat like Jeremy Corbyn winning power in Britain. And he came extraordinarily close in 2017 to winning power. We shouldn't forget that. So there are many millions of people in the United Kingdom who actually identified with and were supportive of his message of a fairer, equal, and more just society in Britain, and a Britain that communicates those sorts of values into its foreign policy as well. And that would include countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, human rights abusing countries that play an absolutely appalling role in the world today. But there is an even greater danger, Crispin, that I should highlight. And that is that when you are falsely accusing people like Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism to ensure that they cannot win power, to ensure that they cannot upset the status quo of the establishment, because we look, a choice of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, my own constituency MP, is no choice at all. It is a choice of different types of conservatism that will ensure the survival and increasing unequal prosperity of the establishment in Britain. But what is happening at the same time as that is actual anti-Semites, actual racists are let off the hook. So I would be very curious to know, because I have missed them, when Rachel Riley has, for instance, criticized the fact that Donald Trump was invited with full state honors to 10 Downing Street and to Buckingham Palace, when Rachel Riley has in fact objected to Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, being invited to 10 Downing Street as he is regularly. Because let's look at the reality of these people. Orban uses anti-Semitism in every single one of his election campaigns. He uses an image that was known as Hohenheim during the Second World War and makes it look a little bit like George Soros, who is of Hungarian origin. And he uses it so that the Hungarian people are voting against someone who he is creating as an enemy of the Hungarian people. Let us look at what Donald Trump's supporters do. At the same time as supporting the state of Israel, bizarrely, which shows their pathetic level of political understanding, they wear shirts that say things like Camp Auschwitz, 6 million wasn't enough. They want more Jews dead. And they don't understand the hypocrisy of doing that while the person next to them is holding an Israeli flag while they storm the Capitol on the 6th of January in 2021. And the problem is that if we make false accusations of any form of racism against people, it means that people who are actually perpetrating anti-Semitism, which is a very real problem, people who are actually perpetrating Islamophobia, which is a very real problem, people who are actually perpetrating anti-Black racism, which is a very real problem, are being let off the hook. And that's why I come back to where I started at the beginning. You are either against all forms of racism and discrimination, or you are part of the racism problem. And therefore, I would suggest that the British honours system has absolutely nothing to do with fighting anti-Semitism, has nothing to do with anti-racism, because the British state itself has been a source of racism and even historically of anti-Semitism. So I think, Crispin, we need to understand the awarding of these honors in the historical context in which they come. And it's an historical context that is still being used to safeguard the perpetuation of inequality, injustice, and basically the creation of a Britain where more people are using food banks than at any time since the end of the Second World War, when nurses are having to use food banks to feed their families, but are being identified by our politicians as the enemy because they want to go on strike for better pay so that they can actually live and feed their families, and for better working conditions so that we, the taxpayers in this country, can actually get better services, be it in our hospitals, on our trains or buses, or in so many aspects of our common life in the United Kingdom. And this is the tragedy of the honours list every year, not just this year. It honours people often whose understanding of politics is limited, or who pursue an appalling reactionary agenda. And that is what we've witnessed with the honours list in 2023.
I think the honour shows a lot of contempt for the British population who voted in their millions for Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, they think that they can honour someone who's called him a racist, effectively. Is that not, is that not telling about what the establishment in this country, it's so contemptuous. I mean, it's in your face.
Let's be absolutely clear. Let's be absolutely clear, Crispin.
Yeah.
There is an acceptable way to engage in politics, and there is an unacceptable way to engage in politics. The acceptable way is if it doesn't threaten the established order within Britain and within the world. The unacceptable way is if you actually challenge that order. And the reality is that Jeremy Corbyn challenged that order. So the almost 10 million people who voted for Jeremy Corbyn, they are described by the establishment in this country as nuts, as stupid, as uninformed, etc., etc. So, we've got to understand that people like you and I, who would describe ourselves as progressive, who want a Britain that is more just, that is more equal, and that is fairer. We are not seen as practicing acceptable politics. People who protest against Israel, Palestine Action, who occupy an Israeli drone factory, 10 of which exist in the United Kingdom, they are seen as beyond the pale because all of that is threatening to the established order. So we are treated appallingly by the British establishment every single day of our lives. What is far more important about that treatment is not the honors that people are given. You know, it's like the way people care about the royal family in this country, which I have to say I find bizarre. You know, I know of Prince Andrew's history, not only of his behavior in relation to Jeffrey Epstein, which cost the taxpayer of this country millions of pounds to settle, because the money that his mother paid to settle the criminal accusations against him in relation to having sex with underage girls ultimately comes from the taxpayer, because that's how the royal family is funded. You know, Prince Andrew has been involved in more corrupt arms deals in his lifetime than most of the arms dealers that I've investigated in my books and films. Prince Charles has done more to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, who are using those arms to kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians in Yemen, and of course, to commit human rights abuses against their own population. And of course, you know, the way in which this country spends money on things like the honors list and all sorts of other things, on tax breaks for corporations, for billionaires, while at the same time, more people than ever before need to use food banks. This is the most disgusting abrogation of the establishment's responsibility to British citizens, far more than the honors list. The honors list is the bauble on top. If you play the game nicely and you help the establishment to keep control of the society as it has for so long, then you get given an honor. Whoopee. Honestly, I think that British citizens shouldn't care about that because they should understand from whence it comes. And I only wish there were more people of integrity in this society who turned down those honors, like Peter Tatchell, Benjamin Zephaniah, and others have, who actually realize that to be decorated with the Order of the British Empire, given the history of the British Empire, is in itself offensive, not only to the people of Britain, but to people across half the world where the British Empire actually colonized. So of course, it's a finger in the eye of the British public. It's spitting in the face of the British public. But that's what the establishment does to the majority of the British public every day. What we need in this country is a media that actually exposes it, rather than a media that celebrates it. And unfortunately, most of the media focuses on things like the honors list, like the royal family, and how wonderful they are for the country, rather than focusing on the reality of what our governments, and unfortunately a Labour government at this point would be no different, what they do every day to the hardworking, suffering people of Great Britain. That would be far more important.